I've decided to start a new life without you. Those were my husband's words. Not a toast, just these words, tossed out into the air of a fancy restaurant, where we'd gathered to celebrate our daughter's college graduation. He stood there with his champagne glass still raised, like he was about to honor Natalie's achievements. But instead, he blindsided us all with that line. The sound of silverware stopped cold. Conversations died mid-sentence. About 30 people glanced between us, all of them expecting me to fall apart, to burst into tears or make a dramatic exit. Instead, I smiled and said, "Well, congratulations on your honesty. I'm Laura Hayes. I am 50. And up until that exact moment, I had been nailing the part of loyal wife and dedicated mom. I'd put my own ambitions on pause so Jason could chase different business ventures, jump into 3 career changes, and survive endless phases of figuring himself out. I raised our daughter, Natalie, who was sitting right beside me, graduation cap still slightly crooked on her head, her face frozen in a look of shock. Just past her, I could spot Jessica Wells, Jason's girlfriend, at least 15 years younger than him, looking like she wanted to disappear into her seat at a back table. She was sitting with people I'd called friends for decades. Apparently, the same people who knew about the affair but somehow never thought to fill me in. The same Jessica who used to show up at our holiday parties. Who once called me, of all people, for career advice. I stayed calm, reached into my handbag, and pulled out a blue-colored envelope, sealed and ready. I placed it neatly next to Jason's plate. "What's this?" he asked, the confidence on his face already starting to fade. "Something for you to read later," I said, keeping my tone steady. Then I turned to Natalie. Her skin had gone pale. I kissed her cheek and told her, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Today is still your day." I got up, smoothed out my dress, and looked around the silent room. "Please, enjoy your meal. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon," I said to the crowd. And with that, I walked out of the restaurant. My chin was up, my back straight. I could feel all those eyes trailing me as I moved toward the door. It swung closed behind me with a heavy thud, cutting off the low buzz of whispered speculation that had just started to rise. The heavy July heat slammed into me the moment I stepped outside, but for once, I welcomed it. It felt like I could finally breathe. Then I heard it. The restaurant door slammed open, and Jason came rushing out. His voice wasn't cool or confident anymore. It was high, frantic. "Laura. What the hell is this? What did you do?" I just kept walking and let myself smile a little. That envelope was the first move in a plan I'd been quietly putting together for months. I'd always been the one keeping things grounded in our marriage. Jason was the dreamer, the one chasing wild ideas. I was the one who kept things running smoothly. When he poured money into his friend's doomed restaurant, I quietly made sure Natalie's college savings stayed intact. And when his midlife crisis pushed him to quit a steady job to chase some short-lived dream of making handcrafted dinnerware, something he dropped after 5 months, I picked up extra hours at Upper Corp to keep us afloat. Meanwhile, my own dreams kept getting shoved to the back burner. After Natalie graduates, I told myself. After Jason settles down. Then, some months ago, I started noticing odd things in our joint bank accounts. Small transfers to an account I didn't recognize. After 2 decades of managing our family's money, those little red flags lit up instantly. I could have confronted him right away. But something told me to wait. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just the growing emotional gap between us. Instead of tipping my hand, I started digging. And what I found was worse than I'd imagined. For over a year, Jason had been siphoning off money into a separate account. He'd been wining and dining Jessica, buying her jewelry, even browsing beach homes, with our money. All while telling me we needed to tighten the belt so we could retire one day. Then came the text messages, left wide open when he forgot to lock his phone. Texts about the new life they were planning together. About how he was finally breaking free. About their big post-graduation escape plan. What Jason failed to remember, or maybe never realized, is that I've worked in finance for 25 years. I know how to follow a money trail. And most importantly, I hadn't forgotten about the prenup we signed 26 years ago, back when I had more family money than he did, and he wanted protection for his future earnings. Ironically, that prenup had a fidelity clause. And it was about to bite him hard. While Jason was busy dreaming up a beach house with Jessica, I was building a legal case. I consulted lawyers. I tracked every sneaky transfer. I gathered every receipt, every text. I prepared the divorce paperwork and timed it all just right, knowing full well Jason would wait until after Natalie's big day to drop the hammer. He thought he had control. What he didn't know was that I'd already filed the divorce papers that morning. They were tucked away in the court system, not yet visible to him. He thought he was being clever. But I was already 3 steps ahead. I didn't go back to the restaurant. I drove straight home. I pulled into the driveway and walked into the house, calm and composed. We'd shared this home for over a decade, and everything still looked exactly as it always had: the family pictures on the walls, the old grandfather clock my father left me, and the same worn leather couch where Jason and I once talked about growing old together. But even though nothing had physically changed, everything felt different now. I headed upstairs to the master bedroom and opened the closet. Just as I expected, Jason's clothes were already packed into suitcases, neatly stashed in the back, ready for his planned departure the next day. That was him in a nutshell: impeccable when it came to how he folded his shirts, but sloppy with the things that truly mattered. My phone started buzzing almost non-stop. Messages poured in from friends who'd been at the restaurant, from Natalie, even from Jason's sister. I only replied to Natalie. I let her know I was okay, that this wasn't her burden to carry, and I reminded her to enjoy her graduation day. I promised we'd talk later and told her I loved her. I'd shielded her from the truth for months. There was no way I was going to let her final semester get weighed down by our mess. I knew she'd be upset that I hadn't told her sooner, but deep down, I also knew she'd understand. Natalie had my level-headedness and her father's charm, a powerful combination that had already carried her far. About 2 hours later, I heard Jason's car pull in. The front door slammed open, and his voice echoed through the house, sharp and demanding. I was sitting quietly in the living room, reviewing documents on my laptop. I calmly closed it as he came storming in, his face flushed, holding the envelope I'd left on the table. He was furious. In his hand were the divorce papers I had served him, something he hadn't anticipated, at least not before his dramatic reveal. He demanded to know how I could do such a thing on this particular day. I explained that I thought the timing actually worked out well. He wanted a fresh start, and I had simply helped make the transition smoother. He claimed I had no right. I told him I had every right, just as he had every right to choose Jessica. When he tried to argue that the prenup had expired, I corrected him. He hadn't read the fine print, or more likely, had never bothered to review it at all. Section 9 clearly stated that the fidelity clause remained valid throughout the entire marriage. The smugness drained from his face almost immediately. That prenup, the one he'd pushed for decades ago to protect himself, was about to cost him nearly everything. The house. The Napa property. A good portion of our retirement savings. His show at the restaurant had just become the most expensive toast he'd ever made. He dropped onto the couch, claiming we'd built our life together and that I was tearing it apart. I reminded him that he was the one who walked away from it first, just not in the way he had planned. His phone kept buzzing. He glanced at it, then let it go. It was probably Jessica, waiting for him to show up at their new apartment. Their careful plan was already starting to unravel. He tried to take a different approach then, saying I'd always been calculated, but this time I'd gone too far. He asked if none of our 26 years together meant anything to me. I looked at him, the man I had loved deeply. And I told him honestly, our history did matter. That was why his betrayal cut so deep. He tried to claim it was just a mistake. I corrected him. It hadn't been some slip-up, it was a long, intentional, strategic choice. He had been hiding money, planning his exit, even scouting beachfront properties while pretending everything was fine at home. He wanted a clean, public breakup to avoid confrontation. But I was one step ahead. I told him I'd be spending the night at Karen's. He blinked, caught off guard. His own sister's house? I nodded. She wasn't exactly thrilled with him. She'd been the one to first spot him and Jessica together last Christmas. She didn't come to me right away. She gave him the chance to come clean. When he didn't, she came to me. That landed like a punch. Jason had always assumed Karen would take his side. But he'd underestimated how deeply loyalty ran when it was earned. He muttered something about everyone turning against him. I grabbed my purse and a small overnight bag I'd packed earlier. Before leaving, I gave him a deadline. He had until the following evening to get his things out of the house. After that, the locks would be changed. As I reached the door, he made one last attempt to pull at my emotions, asking if I'd even considered how all of this would affect Natalie. That was the moment my composure cracked. I turned and told him, with barely controlled anger, not to dare hide behind our daughter. He wasn't thinking about Natalie when he was planning a new beachfront life with another woman. I couldn't help but smile as I walked away from the house. Jason thought he'd secured his fresh start with a shiny new apartment. He had even signed the lease under both his and Jessica's names just 3 weeks earlier. What he didn't realize was that the application never made it through. It had been flagged for credit inconsistencies, and when the leasing agent called our home number to verify the details, I happened to be the one who answered. I made sure that lease quietly fell through. Now, one of the first pieces of his carefully constructed new life was already crumbling. I left him standing in the wreckage of his own decisions and drove across town to Karen's house. She lived in a cozy bungalow near the university where she taught philosophy. When I arrived, she greeted me with a fierce hug and immediately pulled me inside. She had just heard from Natalie and was understandably concerned. I told her honestly, I was doing better than I expected. In the kitchen, she'd already opened a bottle of wine. We poured ourselves glasses and tried to process everything. Karen was shocked that Jason had chosen to make such a spectacle in a crowded restaurant. She said it was dramatic even for him. I agreed, it was all about control. He wanted to humiliate me in public, force me into silence by creating a scene where any reaction on my part would seem hysterical. We sat in her sunroom, surrounded by books and plants, a space that reflected Karen's quiet independence. She had never married, choosing her career and freedom instead. Over the years, I'd sometimes envied her peace, her ability to build a life without sacrificing parts of herself. Curious, she asked what I had put in the envelope that had shaken Jason so badly. I laid it all out, the divorce filing, the financial records showing his deception, and most importantly, the prenup that would leave him with far less than he had counted on. Karen remembered that agreement well. Jason had been so insistent on it back when he received that first loan from my father to start his business. He'd wanted to protect himself. The irony wasn't lost on either of us now. Just then, my phone rang. It was Natalie. Her voice was tight with emotion. She told me she was already on her way to Karen's. About 20 minutes later, Natalie arrived. She was still in her graduation dress, but her makeup was smudged from crying. She collapsed into my arms, just like she used to after a bad dream when she was little. Through tears, she asked why I hadn't told her. I explained gently that I hadn't wanted to ruin the final stretch of her college experience. She had worked too hard for that day, and I wanted her to have it. She pulled back and wiped her face. Jason had ruined it anyway. We moved to the living room, and I finally gave her the full picture, how I discovered the affair, the hidden transfers, and the carefully timed plan Jason and Jessica had put together. Natalie admitted she'd sensed something wasn't right. Her father had been distracted, constantly checking his phone, but she never imagined it was this. A moment later, a text came through from my attorney, Daniel Foster. The emergency court filing had gone through. The accounts I'd identified were frozen until the divorce proceedings moved forward. Jason would have limited access, just enough to cover basic expenses, but nowhere near what he'd need to buy that beachfront property with Jessica. I showed the message to Karen and Natalie. Natalie nodded firmly. In her eyes, he deserved every consequence. I reminded her gently that he was still her father, and whatever happened between us didn't have to define their relationship. She shook her head. Maybe someday, she said, but not now. He'd hugged her that morning, told her how proud he was, while secretly planning to blow up our family that same day. Our conversation was cut short by the doorbell. Karen stepped away to answer it, then returned a moment later with a look of concern. Jason had arrived. And he wasn't alone. Jessica stood beside him, clearly uncomfortable. She shifted on her feet, her gaze flitting nervously around the room. At 34, she wasn't exactly a stereotypical trophy girlfriend, but she was still 16 years younger than me, with the polished look of someone who hadn't been tested much by life. Jason, on the other hand, looked furious. The desperation I'd seen earlier had turned to anger. He demanded that I stop this madness, that I unfreeze the accounts, that we talk like reasonable adults. Before I could respond, Natalie stood up, placing herself just slightly in front of me, a small but protective gesture. She reminded him that he'd had his chance to be reasonable, and that choosing to drop a bombshell at her graduation was anything but. Jason seemed surprised to see her there. He tried to dismiss her, claiming this didn't involve her, but Natalie wasn't having it. She reminded him exactly how involved she was. He had shattered her family on a day that was supposed to be about her success. Jessica gently urged him to leave, sensing the tension, but Jason wasn't ready to walk away. He insisted he wouldn't go until I agreed to be rational. Karen stepped in then, arms crossed, reminding him that I was the only rational one in the room. That he had created this mess. I told him calmly that the accounts would remain frozen until the preliminary hearing, which was set for 5 days from now. At that point, a judge would begin the process of dividing our assets. He seemed stunned. 5 days? What was he supposed to do in the meantime? I reminded him that he had a separate account, the one he'd been secretly transferring funds into for over a year. That should be enough for now. At this, Jessica turned to him, clearly blindsided. She asked how much money was in that account. Jason didn't answer. A new tension entered the room. It was obvious he hadn't been fully honest with her either. He ignored her and called me vindictive, said this wasn't like me. But maybe, I told him, he never really knew who I was. Natalie, turning her attention to Jessica, asked whether she had known about Jason's plan to make his announcement in such a public way. Jessica looked genuinely embarrassed. She admitted she thought he was going to speak to me privately. The graduation spectacle had caught her off guard too. Jason glared at her, betrayal written all over his face. It was clear their so-called united front was already showing cracks. Karen had seen enough. She stepped in and asked them both to leave. Jason tried to appeal to Natalie one last time, saying relationships change and that sometimes people grow apart. But her expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. What she understood, she said, was that he had been too much of a coward to even give me the decency of a private conversation. What she saw clearly now was that, while she was working 2 jobs to help pay for textbooks because he claimed money was tight, he had been stealing from our family. Once they were gone, Natalie collapsed next to me on the sofa, crying. She said she had never spoken to her father like that before. Karen brought us fresh glasses of wine and raised hers to new beginnings. I silently agreed, this ending was really just the beginning. The preliminary hearing was held in a small courtroom on a rainy Monday morning. I arrived with my attorney, Daniel. Jason showed up with a lawyer he had retained in a hurry, a young associate from a corporate firm, not one familiar with family law. It was another sign of how unprepared he really was. The judge, a sharp, no-nonsense woman, reviewed the prenuptial agreement carefully. When Jason's lawyer tried to argue that the document had expired due to the time that had passed, she read aloud the clause stating its duration lasted through the marriage and any legal proceedings resulting from its end. There was no expiration. As she continued, the judge pointed out that the evidence of hidden fund transfers appeared to breach financial disclosure requirements. She ruled to maintain the freeze on our joint accounts until a full financial discovery could be completed. Jason's personal account would remain accessible, and the family home would stay in my possession under the terms of the infidelity clause. Jason muttered that the decision was outrageous, but the judge didn't flinch. She told him he might want to reread the agreement he had signed. A full hearing was scheduled for 40 days later. In the hallway afterward, Jason tried once more to reason with me, asking if 26 years of marriage didn't mean anything. I told him it had meant everything, until he decided it didn't. Then I walked away, leaving him in that corridor with nothing but the weight of his own choices. Word spread quickly among our social circle. Some friends reached out with kind words. Others just wanted the details. I kept my replies simple and dignified, just that Jason and I were separating, and these things happen. Meanwhile, Jason's carefully curated image began to collapse. His reputation as a successful businessman and devoted family man couldn't survive the reality. With the financial freeze in place, he couldn't keep the promises he'd made to Jessica. The beachfront property fell through. The deposit he'd placed on a luxury car was forfeited. 2 weeks after the hearing, Karen called me, barely hiding her amusement. Jessica had already moved out. She'd found out Jason's business wasn't as successful as he had led her to believe, and the substantial savings he'd mentioned didn't exist. Apparently, she'd told a friend that she didn't sign up to date a man with financial problems. I laughed. Jason had always been good at appearances, until reality caught up. As for me, I was rebuilding. The financial safety net I had quietly maintained outside our joint accounts gave me the freedom to move forward. I rented a small office downtown and began building the consultancy I had dreamed about for years. My first clients were 2 women going through divorces of their own. Word spread quickly. I found purpose in helping women understand their finances during difficult life changes, divorce, widowhood, new careers. The work was deeply fulfilling in a way my corporate job had never been. Natalie, now working for a marketing firm, called often. During one of those calls, she said something simple that stayed with me. "I'm so proud of you, Mom." I told Natalie how my client list was growing. She said I was helping people at their lowest points. I just told her the truth. I was doing what I wished someone had done for me. Preparing women for whatever's next felt solid. Being relied on for what I knew, not just what I gave, was new, and kind of liberating. The final divorce hearing landed on what would have been our 27th anniversary. Jason looked worn down. I'd heard his business wasn't holding up without me managing the financials. Jessica was long gone, already with someone else. Word had gotten around, and most of our friends had taken a step back from him once they knew the full story. The judge upheld the prenup exactly as written. Jason kept his personal things, the shaky business, and what was left in his private account, barely enough to cover legal bills and a small apartment. I kept the house, my retirement, and most of the joint assets. That prenup he was so eager to sign all those years ago. It ended up doing its job, just not the way he imagined. After the hearing, he came up to me in the hallway. Said he'd made a mistake and asked if maybe there was a chance. I told him no. Not cruel, just final. He nodded, and for once, didn't push. He told me he hoped I'd be happy. It sounded genuine. Maybe it was. For years, I introduced myself as a wife, and as a mom, and for a long time, that felt like enough. But now, I was something more. Still a mother, of course, but also a business owner, a financial advisor, and a woman quietly piecing back together the parts of herself she'd been setting aside for everyone else.